Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the glitter ball of political podcasts. I'm Ros Taylor. On today's show, we'll be taking apart Keir Starmer's speech at the Labour Party conference. He's a glittering working-class hero who wants to bulldoze planning regulations, but can he do it? We look at past conference speeches we've loved and suffered and ask how much they really matter. And in the extra bit, I ask the panel why on earth everyone's so into magic and the occult these days. Let's wave my wand and meet the panel. Seth Thevoz is a journalist and writer, author of Behind Closed Doors. Hello, Seth.
Hello, Ros.
Keir Starmer announced yesterday that there would be new towns, Labour new towns, built around the country. He's going to bulldoze those planning rules, feel the nimbus quiver with fury. Where would you build a new town? And bear in mind that an Oh God, What Now listener may be right now living in that place.
Well, I think this is fantastic news, unambiguously. We have over the years been held back by the myth of the British countryside as this vast, unspoilt area that must be kept in pristine state, and the green belt must be kept in place as it has been since the 1930s. In reality, very little of the UK is actually genuinely wild. I mean, I don't want to overstate how developed it is, because Britain is not as developed as we like to think. But if you're looking at pristine countryside, I'd ask the question a different way. Where would I not build new towns? I wouldn't build new towns in the Scottish Highlands. I wouldn't build new towns in rural Wales. I wouldn't build new towns in Devon and Cornwall. Apart from that, everywhere else, I'm fine. It's fair game.
Everywhere. I mean, there's a load of national parks as well. You've got to keep away from those.
You've got to live in places, you know.
Controversial. More about Starmer's speech coming up later. But fresh from Labour conference and on the panel for the first time, it's Podmaster's managing editor, Jacob Jarvis. Hello, Jarv.
Hey, Ros.
It looked pretty busy in Liverpool, and I was a bit envious of you, to be honest, because I've never done a party conference there. Plus, I was meant to be going to Brighton for the Greens, but I caught COVID. Anyway, could you feel the excitement and the lust for power surging through the city?
I'm not sure if excitement is exactly the right word. It was certainly incredibly positive, and everyone it felt like a government in waiting. You know, when you would see shadow ministers walking around, they were being treated very much as if they were almost in power already. But there was this sense of pragmatism and clearly some trepidation of the fact that if Labour does come into power, they're coming in a state of circumstances which are not ideal for anyone to govern in, and the fact that we don't know when the election will be. So how bad that can get to that point is still pretty much completely unknown. So it was certainly really, really positive, but the excitement was weighted by this pragmatism that everything will have to be measured, potentially rolled back, depending on whatever this lot do for the next few months, really.
Yasmin Serhan is a staff writer at Time. Hello, Yasmin.
Hello.
As we record on Wednesday afternoon, the Israeli Defense Force is preparing for an assault on Gaza. Details of a horrific massacre at a kibbutz near the border have been emerging. You've been writing for Time about what a ground invasion of Gaza would mean.
Yeah, I mean, nothing, of course, is confirmed, but I think, as you just said, it's really a question of when, not if, Israel chooses to launch a ground invasion. They've mobilized an unprecedented more than 300,000 reservists. So you don't really do that, right, unless you're planning something big. Of course, airstrikes in Gaza have already begun. And in fact, I've been trying to reach people in Gaza all day today. The fact that they run out of electricity makes it seem like I've probably, and I think a lot of others, have missed the boat. So I'm also kind of worried that we're about to go into a media blackout in terms of kind of the state of play in Gaza. But what we do know is that the last time Israel launched a ground invasion in the Strip, that was in 2014, more than 2,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of them I should say a significant majority of them, I want to say 7 out of 10 were civilians, died. At last I checked today, that death toll in Gaza alone, and of course it's to say nothing of the horrible death toll in Israel, is over 1,000 Palestinians dead. So it's safe to say that, you know, the death and destruction that we've seen so far has really only just begun.
There have been exchanges of fire with Hezbollah militants in Lebanon too, worryingly. Is a wider war that might draw in Lebanon and Syria a real possibility?
I think that's certainly a concern. I know when I've spoken to Israeli experts, they talked about the unprecedented scale of mobilization as being not just in preparation for a potential ground invasion in Gaza, but also as a form of deterrence to kind of, in case there is a northern front to the war. And as you say, we have been seeing some confrontation between Israeli soldiers and Hezbollah and others, and there has been some rocket fire, I believe, from Syria as well, though I don't think they've attributed that to anyone just yet. I think certainly for Hezbollah, entering a wider conflict would come with a lot of risks. I mean, we know the state of Lebanon right now. I don't think that they would really want to entertain getting into a wider regional conflict. And I think they've even come out and said that they are not. I mean, they launched some like solidarity rockets with the Palestinian resistance, but I don't think there is an appetite that we've seen yet. But I mean, who knows what's going to happen? I don't think anyone could have predicted what we've seen just in the past few days, a week ago, a month ago. To an extent, I think people always talked about this region as, something that was about to explode, like it was a tinderbox, and it very much was. And we've seen that, those predictions have come true. So, it's very unprecedented, but also very grim at the same time.
How have the other big players in the region responded? Because there are reports that Iran trained and armed Hamas before this assault. Iran denies that.
Yeah. I mean, what's important to say here is that both U.S. and Israeli officials have told the press so far that there's no firm evidence that Iran was authorized or directly coordinated this attack. That said, we do know that Iran and Hamas have a close relationship, not to the extent that Iran has with Hezbollah, but, I think last year, the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, said that the group would receive $70 million from Iran. So in terms of funding, in terms of weapons, in terms of training, Iran probably has its fingerprint over a lot of this, but as far as we can tell, Iran has not played, was not organizing, did not plot this, and as you say, they're denying that.
Labour's new slogan is "Let's get Britain's future back." Like levelling up, it might not make much sense when you actually think about it, but then nor did Get Brexit Done. As Keir Starmer prepared to deliver his speech, a protester jumped on stage and showered him with glitter, so he spent an hour twinkling in the stage lights like a very gruff fairy. Jarv, meanwhile, managed to get on-the-spot insight with some friends of the podcast. You may have heard the full interview with Stella Creasy MP as a Bunker podcast special. Here she is, plus Marina Perkis of the Trawl podcast and Steve Richards of Rock and Roll Politics.
So I thought what was really interesting was him actually talking a bit about life. And I know that sounds odd because you think, well, of course, politicians are talking about life. But just talking, I thought it was very powerful, particularly he was talking about all the things people haven't been able to do, all the kind of everyday little nice things that you do with the kids because of the cost of living crisis. And I thought that was a very powerful motif, actually, that just life isn't very fun at the moment for people. It doesn't have pleasure in it. And yet one of the things about a better society is people being able to enjoy being around each other. There's actually a very famous William Morris kind of quote about that. And William Morris's ideas, Walthamstow Man's, of course I have to quote him, about the pleasure in life and that being something meaningful that you should strive for. So I thought that was very powerful, that just people's lives have been ground down by austerity and ground down by this government, and the contrast between a government in waiting that wanted to do something about that and a government that frankly didn't care.
What's interesting, rather than the press coverage, is the Conservative coverage, because I think they're panicking a bit. You saw Rishi Sunak out doing a PM Connect session, and it's an unwritten rule that during conferences, you let each party have their time in the sun. And actually, Rishi Sunak's out there in not Nottingham. He said it was Nottingham. It wasn't Nottingham. It was Coddington, but he's having a mare there. And he's out there talking to people, to staff at Curry's, which he should be doing, which I think shows how desperate he is. He just had his big keynote speech at the Tory conference, and yet maybe it didn't quite land, so he's having to do a bit more work to try and detract attention away from the success of the Labour conference. And then you've got Jeremy Hunt, who used to be a serious politician, albeit a terrible one, having to put out there on social media, along with memes that Tory comms think are appropriate, saying inflation is the number one problem for the country, and Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, didn't mention it once. And yet she spoke numerous times about rising prices, rising bills, which is inflation. She didn't use the term, and I think it just shows how desperate they are to counter what is actually quite a good vibe coming out of this conference.
Britain is in a complete mess. It's out of Europe. Labour had the advantage of being in Europe when they came in 97. The economy's not growing. It was growing quite a lot in 97. and public services are dire. And therefore, to just say, oh, we're going to, reduce a classroom size here and there, is not enough. Now, it's always difficult because the tax and spend debate in Britain always makes public spending seem like a threat when Labour propose it, rather than a source of hope. So they have to find ways of indicating things are going to improve without spending money. It's really difficult. I think in her speech, the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves pulled it off brilliantly, but it's a tough one to do.
Jarvis, Starmer said this was a changed Labour Party, no longer enthralled to gesture politics, no longer a party of protest, a party of service. What did the delegates make of it?
Well, I didn't manage to get into the hall itself because it was so absolutely packed. I then tried to get into a fringe event watch-along, and that was also completely sold out. So I went and watched it in a hotel bar on the television, which was also completely packed out without a seat. So it's clear that a lot of people wanted to watch him and see him. And it went down resoundingly well as far as I could see. From everyone I spoke to, it was quite startling to, considering the state of politics in recent years, to be somewhere where people felt mainly on the same page, or even on points where they weren't on the same page, that they could have reasoned debate on it, and consider the fact that they clearly realise Starmer is someone that would be better to be in power than Rishi Sunak would be, and everyone seems aligned with that. So most people I spoke to were really resoundingly happy with how things were going, even when it came to questions over sort of some lack of detail and stuff like that, was always answered by, as I said in the icebreaker, that, well, the issues with detail is we don't know what the state of play will be. So it all seemed that they really were very much in unison. You didn't see the usual sort of squabbling that you would expect. And in contrast to what we saw in Manchester, it was just quite bizarre, really, to be somewhere so normal.
At one point, he even asked disillusioned Conservative voters to join him in the Labour Party, and that is a bit of a departure for the sort of never-kissed a Tory faction in the Labour Party, who are, can be quite loud. And it was also quite a patriotic speech, and it was backed by the Union flag and red, white and blue everywhere, which is the new design for Labour membership cards. Is Labour now at ease with all this? Because a few years ago, they definitely weren't.
It feels like they've become at ease with the notion of being pragmatic and not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good. They know that the way the country is at the moment, we can't have perfection, but things can only get better, as was constantly playing out the whole time I was there. Unfortunately, things have got better for me since I've stopped hearing that song in my head on repeat. But it feels like the pragmatism is just there in understanding that we simply need change to happen. And on things like patriotism, I thought that's always a hard line to toe. But the way that Keir Starmer framed that, and it being not a patriotism that's just a nonsensical pride in a place simply because of it being a place where you were born, it being that this is somewhere patriotism requires you to be actively engaged and want to make the place you are better, and want that to be better for the people that live around you, and be patriotic for your friends and family and the other citizens around there. So that kind of depends on your interpretation of patriotism. And then the questions of, say, there being the flag on the membership cards and stuff like that, that's always going to be the sort of thing that gets picked apart, those little details. But it also feels to me like a party which is no longer sweating the small stuff in those sort of ways. They're not letting those kind of debates really blow up and picking over them. Everyone is going, okay, you know what? We need to do this for real this time. And that discipline has really leaked down. And whether you agree with Starmer for being like that and having that sort of iron fist he's been accused of or not, that's up for debate. But it clearly is doing something for him.
Yeah, it felt like sort of patriotism of the kind that Sundar Katwala, for example, at British Future talks about. And I talked about that with him on the bunker a few months ago, rather than nationalism. There wasn't any talk of borders or migration, but we'll get to
you don't have to
later.
Be populist to be able to be patriotic, do you?
Seth, no one comes to a Starmer speech expecting to be mesmerised, but is he getting better at public speaking?
Yes, I mean, I think we were saying just before the show that he clearly has been working on this in a way, but also, I mean, it was an unremarkable speech. It was pretty workmanlike and pretty pedestrian and quite dull in places. And you know what? I actually have a lot of time for that. After turmoil and crisis, and, he didn't have somebody coming up in the middle of his speech to give him a P45, although he did have the heckler, which actually was a bit of fun. We can talk about that a bit. But he wasn't trying to be something or someone else. I remember during the election that never was of 2007, when they were building up to this, Labour put out a poster for Gordon Brown saying, "Not Flash, just Gordon." And that very much is the sort of look they seem to be going for here.
What is his rhetorical style? Does he have one? Is he developing one?
Yeah, I think it's very much what you see is what you get. And it's based on public trust. It's not based on rhetorical fireworks or being John F. Kennedy. The leader's style he actually reminds him of the most is John Smith. The late John Smith was very businesslike, very straightforward, quite a sort of details person. He wasn't charismatic by any means, but people liked and respected him. And actually, very few politicians are good orators, and even those who are doesn't necessarily translate into good government.
I thought he showed charisma in a way by just showing some level of normality and understanding the normal issues that people have, like that, as he said, people not being able to just go to a supermarket and get a treat of some kind at the end of the day. And I mean, the heckler, obviously there's a concern that really just shouldn't have happened. Someone shouldn't be able to get that close to the leader of opposition. And it was a bit sort of heart in mouth moment, but did give him the actual literal metaphor, being able to roll up his sleeves and get on with it, which is what the speech felt like.
To some extent. I did think there was a little bit that was going in a slightly strained direction to try and show how normal he was, stressing, "I took a holiday in Britain in the Lake District and had my fish and chips." It was a bit heavy.
I also had a holiday in the Lake District earlier this year and had some fish and chips.
Well, likewise, but we don't make a point about talking about But yeah, it's the sort of showing off and going out of words. And to be fair, he was joking in a couple of places about how, you're going to expect me to say this, but my father was a toolmaker, because we've heard enough of that by this stage that fine, it's his brand.
I like that's become a point of mocking for both leaders, with Sunak, son of a pharmacist, and him, son of a toolmaker. It's just like, we get it.
Yasmin, Starmer talked about the age of insecurity yesterday and the importance of making people feel secure and respected. Are we seeing a theme develop here? And what does that mean for policy?
I think so. And I think actually when I read that portion of the speech, it reminded me very much of the German elections in 2021, when Olaf Scholz, who was then leader of the opposition Social Democrats, now chancellor, of course, was his kind of big theme of his campaign was respect. In fact, there were these big, vibrant red posters just all across the country with that one word and his face on it. And the whole point of that was really to say that, it was I think to try to really challenge the image that the Social Democrats had of, not being down to earth, not like kind of understanding kind of the needs of real people. And he basically, I watched one of his final speeches ahead of the race where he was basically saying that, no one should feel like they're less important or less valued or less heard than anyone else. So hearing Starmer speak, it very much heard that. And actually, struck me as probably quite deliberate, because I know when I interviewed him for Time earlier this year, he talked about how he was taking lessons from center-left parties that had won power in Germany and Australia and the US. So it probably makes sense. And it also makes him seem, I think, a bit more receptive to the actual what people are feeling and thinking. Whereas, of course, we saw the Prime Minister giving his conference speech, which, of course, did its kind of own things in terms of really focusing on him and having that theme of change. But, he was talking about HS2 and God, what were the other issues now that I've just completely forgotten, despite having been in Manchester last week? But I think that's the point, right? It didn't really feel like the most pressing issues were being discussed in this case. As for policy, I think to the point that Jarv made, the fact that there was this kind of overarching idea of, we want to give you hope, but not too much, because we are going to have issues, I think is also important, because, that speech was very hopeful. And I think it was trying to inject this idea of, we're going to get out of this age of insecurity together. We're going to, rebuild. But we're also going to have to do it within our means.
Where there maybe wasn't detail, was it? There wasn't the word overarching. I think really is useful there, because there was an overarching narrative to what Keir Starmer was saying in comparison to Sunak, which was it's like he threw darts at a board with bollocks talking points and just sort of cobbled it together in that way, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
He did go very, very heavy on the working class credential stuff. I don't know whether that's just to, as a contrast with Rishi Sunak, but we heard about the Pebble Dash semi that he grew up in, and anyone in Britain, I don't know if there's a similar thing in the US, but anyone in Britain kind of knows what that means without having to be told. And of course, as Seth was saying, his father's job as a toolmaker. Well, what's the rationale behind pushing this? Is it just to play down Sir Keir?
Yeah, I think invariably he knows that the Conservatives are going to go after him as Mr. Flip-Flop, as, this North London cosmopolitan elite, all the things that we've heard before. And I think he needs to have a kind of response to that and re-emphasizing, no matter how many times we've heard it, that his father was a toolmaker, that he was the first in his family to go to university, kind of all these things that, he loves football and supports this North London team I've never heard of. These are the things.
It's literally around the corner.
Right. Oh, no, I'm a huge Arsenal fan. I just want to make that clear. These are all the things that make him seem normal, especially when you compare it to Sunak, who, despite being the son of a pharmacist and despite being the son of immigrants and very proudly the first South Asian prime minister, is also very rich, right? So it's, I think he needs to find a way to distinguish himself and be like, no, I'm actually as normal as you're probably going to get.
You did a big interview recently with Humza Yousaf, the First Minister of Scotland, and the SNP is struggling in the polls at the moment. And yesterday, Starmer explicitly condemned Scottish nationalism. But at the same time, he praised Scotland for its green investment, and he was clearly on a charm offensive. How sticky is the support for independence in Scotland, which Labour really has to overcome if it's going to persuade people to vote for it there?
I think it is a sticky issue based mostly on the fact that irrespective of the declining popularity of the SNP, support for independence has actually remained remarkably stable. And that's a problem for the SNP because it means that maybe there's a disentangling of the pro kind of national, like the nationalist voice versus the SNP voice. I think what Starmer needs to do is articulate a really positive message for Scotland in the Union. And I feel like I haven't, heard so much of it. I don't think the Conservatives make kind of a really, a big effort in sort of, or at least if they have, I haven't come across it, but like a really concerted argument for why Scotland's future is better in the Union. And I think we saw little snippets of that in the speech, right? Because he talked about, Scotland being at the heart of a Britain built to last. So I think the more that he does that, then maybe the more he can potentially claw back a bit of that support. But yeah, it's going to be a tricky one, especially if the SNP really, and this was something that came up a lot in my conversation with Yousaf, if they continue to hammer that line that he's basically just, riding to number 10 on the coattails of the Conservatives, that he will keep their austerity and welfare policies, that, their green positions, all sorts of things. So it is going to be a challenge for sure.
Seth, Starmer said he'd bulldoze opposition to house building. He was clear this morning in an interview on Today that sometimes Labour would override the objections of local people to new building. And that feels very, very hard to do. How is Labour going to achieve that?
I'm rather sceptical about how easy it's going to be to keep this promise. He could ultimately threaten to remove the whip from a Labour MP who's being very troublesome on this. But he'd find himself very quickly being accused, like Tony Blair, of being a control freak, of not tolerating dissent. He might also just have difficulty with the chain reaction effect you get amongst Labour MPs, because if the standard response is, I need to be able to hold my seat, I'm not going to do that unless I take a particular line on this particular development in my constituency, that can spread like a contagion amongst other Labour MPs saying, well, if you're not allowing other Labour MPs to do this, then are you really serious about government and holding on to power? So I wish him well on this, but I don't think it's going to be an easy thing to do.
Presumably he's going to have to change laws and all sorts of planning regulations and the ability of local communities to say no to things.
Yes, and remember that the political side of it, in terms of MPs' positioning, might be the most eye-catching part. But a lot of this is actually decision-making that's taken by local officials in local government up and down the country. It's really hard for central government to pull those levers in that way.
Now, let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. Listener Joe Mochan asks, Can the panel rank the best thing that has come out from Labour's conference that they really need to stick with for the election? And in the panel's opinion, what is the thing that they should definitely run with as the number one item? Joe, what do you reckon?
I'm predictably really happy about housing and more houses, and I just think lots of things stem from that. You know, both my parents lived in council houses, grew up in council houses, and I just believe that we simply need more housing and there has to be more social housing. It's the issue which affects you in your day-to-day life. If you're not happy where you live or you are not secure where you live, that is going to tie into everything else, every other facet of your life. So I think that, to me, I'm glad there was boldness there. And I would run on that because I think the Tories have promised and promised and promised and continued to fail, and they keep fudging the numbers on it. It's hard then because they've painted the discourse so much that people will go, well, all politicians are the same and they've promised, so why should we believe your promise? But I think Labour have to try and convince that it's a promise they can keep and make sure it's one that they stick on the front foot with.
Seth, how about you?
There was a little noticed passage in Starmer's speech where he talks about the public ownership of companies, and that's really important right now. I think Labour's in this mindset where they're being very cautious about spending commitments and so on, and they're not wanting to say anything that might be seen as too left-wing, but honestly, pledge to put the water companies back into public control, or the energy companies, and I think that's a vote winner. The railways are already in public hands as railway lines. If you put the trains in public hands as well, there's a strong case for that, actually, as a real vote winner and as something where the time has come.
Yasmin, how about you?
I'm going to piggyback on housing as well. I think that's just an issue that would be just uniting. I just feel like I haven't come across anyone apart from maybe the NIMBY people who say, well, don't build them here. But I feel like no one is saying don't build more houses. I think that's just kind of a widely held position. But equally and kind of weirdly, even though I agree that obviously it was a huge security issue, I think not that he should keep the sparkles, though it was very nice to see a politician be so glittery. But I think him appearing a bit less, because if he really wants to ditch the Sir sort of image, kind of having his sleeves rolled up more, maybe just like kind of seeming a bit more approachable and actually down to get to work rather than just kind of seeming very stiff. And yeah, I don't know. I thought that optics-wise looked quite good.
There's a really fascinating history of how politicians engage with hecklers. And, remember that up until really the 1950s and when television comes in, until then you measure the efficacy of a politician by how well they can handle hecklers, how well they can dodge fruit and veg, how many witty comebacks they have for that kind of thing. And remember, when John Major was on the ropes in 92, the strategy, which turned out to be really successful, was let's go on the road, Dave Allen style, with a stool and actually talk to real voters in a totally non-controlled area and space. And people respect that, and flip it the other way around when Blair was thought to be a little bit too slick in the 2000s. There was what was known as the punish Blair strategy, which is, well, people are going to shout at him anyway, so if we can just do that until they start to feel sorry for him. So contact with voters is a really important thing like that.
That actually reminds me that it feels like there is sort of a spectrum of how politicians relate to that. I think on the one end you have when Suella Braverman was speaking and they escorted the man who I think whispered a criticism out of the room. You had Keir kind of in the middle who basically said, that's like kind of just sort of rolled with it and said that's not going to, he doesn't know me if he thinks that's going to bother me. And then even though they haven't had their conference yet, Hamza Yousaf, when the SNP did gather not too long ago to discuss their independent strategy, a woman was yelling and kind of interrupted his speech. And he ended up actually pausing to go and speak with her and then came back and said, we don't like kind of boo people, but, I'm paraphrasing here, but, we listen to people in our party.
I was struck by how he kept talking about service and how much, the party was ready for service, but also that he said at one point where MPs have only one job, service. And I thought, yes, no more doubling up and earning 100 grand extra a year from GB News. And of course, that does also mean, potentially no lucrative sidelines in consultancy and lawyering and all the things that Labour Party MPs historically have done too. That would be a real change if he's going to insist that his MPs do not make money on the side, but I think it would be quite a healthy thing for British politics. Next this week, remember this.
Next year, I won't be making this speech, but in the years to come, wherever I am, whatever I do, I'm with you. Wishing you well, I'm wanting you to win. You're the future now, so make the most of it.
That was Tony Blair's last speech to conference as PM, and as I can attest, there was barely a dry eye in the conference centre, apart from Gordon Brown's, obviously. Keir Starmer, on the other hand, is not a natural orator, but does that matter? Seth, which British PMs have succeeded despite not being very good at speaking?
Weirdly enough, most of them. I mean, remember that we live in a parliamentary system and they effectively are elected by an electoral college of MPs. The day-to-day is, can they stay in a sort of bear pit environment in Parliament and being strictly partisan? So they don't actually need to appeal to a wider audience for that much of the year or that much of the Parliament. Someone like Anthony Eden, who was known as a great charmer and also a terrible prime minister, was also really bad at public speaking and really stiff and formal. Even someone like, say, Jim Callaghan, who he was considered to be the height of getting in touch with the people and having the common touch in telling an old joke about a music hall, which frankly was for people well into their 60s and 70s in 1978. That's as good as it got. It's been pretty poor on the whole. But I mean, let's look at the counterfactual. What about those prime ministers who've been amazing at rhetoric? Someone like Winston Churchill in his later years, in the 1950s, when he came back, very good at set-piece speeches. But his health was in a really bad state. He'd suffered from multiple strokes for the last couple of years of his premiership. He's held up by doctors and amphetamines, and he can steel himself for these great, fantastic orations and occasions. But does it really matter? If he's not even turning up to cabinet and if he's letting other people chair meetings for him and not really on top of the detail, not really governing, I'm not sure how much the speeches actually matter.
Yasmin, American politicians have to raise a lot more money than British ones in order to be able to run. Does that mean that you just have to be a really good speaker in the US to get anywhere?
I think it really helps. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking back to just, the presidents I've seen in my lifetime. I'm thinking of someone like Barack Obama, who's just probably one of the best presidential orators that I've lived through. But even going back further to Ronald Reagan, of course, I mean, to go on kind of the other side of the political spectrum, which isn't to say that all U.S. presidents have been great orators. I mean, I'm thinking of someone like George W. Bush, known to be particularly poor at that. And of course, I don't know where to put Donald Trump on this, actually, because he wasn't very coherent, but I think he was nonetheless mesmerizing because we just never knew what he was going to say. But I do, yeah, I mean, I think it helps. And I think the best sort of evidence of that currently, and I must admit, I haven't been following this closely because I just can't really bear to, and I'm not paid to, so I won't. But the U.S. sort of presidential kind of contest underway, and particularly the Republican contest, Ron DeSantis was for a long time seen as kind of a natural successor to kind of take over the helm after Donald Trump. But I think one of the things that really destroyed him was the fact that he was seen as very awkward. Like, he's just not a very good communicator. And in fact, while I haven't been watching many of their debates, what I have seen is numerous clips of him saying something and doing that awkward smile at the end, which, people like someone must have told him to do that. But it just comes off really weirdly. And I don't want to bully DeSantis too much because, I don't necessarily think that I'd be a particularly great orator myself. But I think it does matter, and it does kind of, it's just sort of how you come across.
Jarv, have you ever been really moved by a political speech?
So I'm going to go back to a speech which was actually before my time of being alive, but a speech that I do think sticks with me and resonates with me is the Neil Kinnock "I warn you" speech. I just think the line "I warn you not to be ordinary" is just so punchy and so strong and holds true of just conveying his beliefs and who he was and what he was pushing against, and the kind of prescience of how that has lasted and made you think about how conservative governments have treated the public, and there has been disdain in recent years for ordinary people. So when I watch that, it just sort of, you think how different things maybe could have been, and yes, lines like that I just think were really, it's a very strong point to make.
Kinnock is a really interesting one because I remember at the time he was not really regarded as a particularly good speaker. No. And he was mocked a lot, partly because he was Welsh and people were a bit racist about that. But he was not hugely admired. And yet when you look back at some of his speeches now, and when you hear him talk now as well, he's a very powerful speaker.
Yeah, he's really got fire in his belly with that. And I suppose it's kind of do people want really completely polished speakers? Because that's another thing is, your Barack Obama's, for example, is obviously an incredible orator, but he is so slick. And I actually think sometimes you can convey your message without being quite that flawless in ways which Donald Trump, for example, clearly isn't a flawless person, but is, well, as an orator or more generally, but is able to convey something and a feeling. That's what I think a good speech should do, is bring you closer to that person and make you feel like you engage with who they are. That's what gets the idea over. And I don't think that actually necessarily requires you to be a completely sort of debating society polished speaker.
Very few people actually listen, of course, to these conference speeches all the way through. It's only nerds like us who actually sit in front of the TV or the laptop and watch them. But do campaign videos matter more now, do you think, in sort of YouTube, TikTok, something that's shorter and punchier?
Campaign videos are a hard one because I would say the genre of media, they are generally bad. Most campaign videos you see, you think that is either shot quite shoddily or is they centre politicians in a way that I don't necessarily agree is the smartest way to do it. For example, you mentioned Keir Starmer, mentioned how he grew up in a Pebble Dash semi. For example, I think the semi is maybe slightly posh, not the most, not the most, not the most working class place. It needs to be a terrace for me, 2 up, 2 down. But centering yourself so wholly like that rather than who you're speaking to can be the issue with the campaign. But it also ties into what Seth was saying about being able to speak in those unguarded moments. And I'd say the more clippable moments are actually what really spreads. We see that with the media ecosystem we're in at the moment, and that can often come on spontaneity. And whereas Keir Starmer was able to convey himself in that set piece, and politicians do that, everyone knows it's a set piece. And when you actually look at things that do well on social media, it's very often rough around the edges. And that's where people like, to refer to America, people like AOC does really well because it's sort of quite unpolished in that way. So it makes me think of Lisa Nandy, for example, recently on Question Time when she replied to comments around multiculturalism, obviously struck a chord with so many people because it came off. She was saying something she genuinely believed in a moment that was off the cuff. So I actually think politicians need to be better, and we should need to be paying more attention to the points where they're not performing a set piece, because performing a set piece is something you can obviously prepare for and labour over, and actually want people who are able to react in moments. Again, going back to Keir Starmer, how he reacted to that heckler showed a lot more about who he was perhaps than a lot of things he could say.
Lord Finkelstein, who used to write for William Hague, has 2 rules for these speeches. Every half sentence has got to be useful, and never use a joke unless you're absolutely certain that it's funny. I'm surprised that he used to write for William Hague in that case, because I can remember some extremely unfunny moments in William Hague's speeches. Can we think of any other guidelines, rules that speechwriters ought to keep in mind?
Have some good comebacks for hecklers in mind, because heckles matter, as we've said. There's an old line that Harold Wilson used to use really effectively, and I've heard Mingus Campbell use it, which is to say to a heckler in the front row, look, I'll make a deal with you. You stop telling lies about us and we'll stop telling the truth about you. And something like that is really effective.
My one would be suggesting just show your personality, but don't dwell too much on yourself. I think you have to talk consistently about who you are and where you came from as a person, particularly in the role of politician, because at the end of the day, people will look at where you are now and they will see you as being removed from them. You are in a position of power and a position of privilege. So dwelling on your past, whilst that matters and is something you should speak about, I think you can convey your personality by remembering the fact you are trying to win over people who you will be technically employed by. You are there to service them, and that's where, again, this sort of service lines can work. So yeah, don't show who you are without dwelling on the me is something.
I think this is seemingly obvious, but make sure that you're actually saying something. I feel like there's a number of speeches where it just feels like it goes on and on forever and you actually don't know what the point is. And I think a classic example of that was Penny Mordaunt's speech to the Conservative Party conference last week, where I don't want to misquote it, but to the effect of, and if you stand up, your neighbor stands up, and if we stand up, the country, and anyway, I mean, it was just like, it was all this standing up, and by the end of it, I was like, I don't I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what the message is. And yeah, I just also think that you just become a meme. And the last thing you want to do is become a meme for the wrong reasons.
She climaxed much too early. Basically, that one. Seth, you and I were talking about Ian Duncan Smith yesterday. Let's listen to a tiny bit of his 2003 conference speech. And I say tiny because it was agonising.
The quiet man is here to stay, and he's turning up the volume.
This was particularly awful. I was actually there at the time, and he decided to abandon the stage and just move off the stage and move onto the conference floor and have this circle of cronies around him. And it was a complete disaster. But also because there was something very wrong with the sound quality as well, which made him sound particularly tinny. Do you remember that one as well?
I think it's important to just stress the context actually for listeners, because IDS had a really difficult time because he was due to be announced as Tory leader on the 11th of September 2001, and obviously that was delayed. He then has a Tory leader speech that's completely dominated and overshadowed, and no one can remember anything he said. And then a year later, for the 2002 conference, his sort of comeback pitch is, do not underestimate the determination of a quiet man. And for about a week or so, that actually seemed to work. I mean, there were genuine discussions. I remember at the time people saying, okay, this guy isn't charismatic. He's doing the kind of thing we're talking about Keir Starmer doing, saying, I'm not flash, I'm just trying to be somewhat of substance here. And the problem was you then get, ferrets in a sack by way of the Conservative Party over the next year. And what happens a year on from that, 2003, that clip we just listened to, that's him abandoning it and saying, actually, I'm panicking. And he was gone within a matter of days. Yeah. I mean, it really was a last stab in the dark.
That was it. There was no way this man could be allowed to continue. Yasmin, who's the best speechmaker in politics at the moment for your money?
I'd probably say that Zelensky is up there. I think, he's just... It's hard to think of like any particular one from this country or the US, but he strikes me. I mean, I remember when he came and did his surprise address to Parliament earlier this year. I mean, that speech was like so emblematic of the fact that in pretty much all of his speeches, whether it's to Congress or to the Parliament or to wherever, he always has a keen sense of who his audience is and always kind of really tailors them and speaks very powerfully. And in this case, it was kind of reminiscing on his previous trips to the UK, talking about, the closeness of the UK and Ukraine and how the UK came quickly. And then, finally with that really powerful ask for powerful British planes. I think he's, especially given the circumstances, probably one of the more powerful ones that I've seen recently.
Often speeches go down incredibly well at the time they're made, but then they turn out to have been really woefully over-optimistic. I remember watching Bill Clinton address the Labour Party conference in 2002 and talking about how the third way would make the 21st century the greatest the world had ever known. And there were people crying in the audience. I look back and sort of wince. Seth, which ones have stood the test of time for you?
I agree with Yasmin that British examples are quite short on the ground, actually. I'd look more towards America. I mean, the person who really speaks to me on so many levels is Robert F. Kennedy, and he was very good at the set-piece speech. I mean, if you look at something like where he flies to the University of Cape Town in 1966 to condemn the apartheid regime at its height, he's great working off a set text by Ted Sorensen, speechwriter to his late brother, but he's even better speaking off the cuff. I think probably the most emotional and remarkable speech. And if you don't know it, go out right now on YouTube and track down the video of this. It's his speech on the death of Martin Luther King, because he's had about an hour's notice that this tragedy has happened. He is speaking very much off the cuff. He's quoting poetry. More importantly, he's misquoting poetry because it's from the heart. It's not actually something that's slick and well prepared. And he talks about why people want to coexist and live together and live in a better world. He talks about love and the politics of love, which is not something you hear very often these days, but is something that was crucial to that 60s form of liberalism. Hubert Humphrey used to talk about the politics of joy. It was different language and different facets of the same sort of message. And there was an integrity and there was an honesty about that, which really stands the test of time and is in short supply today, I think.
He also referenced his brother in that speech, didn't he, in a way that he maybe hadn't generally done publicly. So to do that and bring that in on the spur of a moment of something which I'm sure is quite traumatic to speak about, it really is.
And to say, I fully understand why right now you are feeling in the throes of violence and you want vengeance, and that's totally understandable because I felt that myself, and I have every reason to, and I know you would. But, channeling that anger for something better, that's important politics.
Yes, get onto YouTube. Best thing you can possibly do on YouTube, in my view, watching political speeches. We've reached the end of the show, so what are the stories that have gone under the radar this week? Jarv.
So I have got one about the fact that Boris Johnson refused talks with Drakeford and Sturgeon within the COVID pandemic. And I mean, there is obviously a desire, and I get it, to move on and to let this be in the past and to let that odious Prime Minister be in the past. But I think you just look at this sort of thing, it's saying that he didn't want the UK to seem like a mini EU, and this everything about it is just, it just feels incredibly stupid, and like it just was pointless to behave in that crass a way. And I do think we just need to be able to remain to pay attention on that. I know that there were a lot of shocking things that happened over that time, and it's easy to let it all go into a milieu. But I think it's important we still continue to focus on those details because it impacted so many people and still is impacting so many people. And I think we should remember that and make sure that these things are paid attention to.
And of course, one of the results of doing that was that Wales and Scotland basically went their own way on restrictions, and we had even more complicated and different restrictions in different parts of the country for different times. Yeah. Yasmin, how about you?
I don't necessarily think this story would have been under the radar if not for the events of recent days. But something that's probably worth flagging is that Poland is going to be having very important elections this weekend, which will determine whether the ruling nationalist Law and Justice Party gets an unprecedented third term. The opposition is a name that British listeners will probably be very familiar with. It's Donald Tusk, leads the center-right opposition party. So it's an important election. I think Ukraine is going to be playing a big role there. But again, I say if things in Israel and Palestine weren't so bad, I think it would get a lot of attention. But I suspect it's probably going to go down people's certainly my sort of list of to-dos.
Yes, also in the EU, there were elections in Bavaria and Hesse in Germany at the weekend, and the right did very well, and the far right, the Alternative for Deutschland, did far better than anyone expected. And this was in West Germany, or former West Germany, I should say, rather than just East Germany, which has formerly been thought of as the place where the AfD were really doing well. And this is particularly difficult because all the other parties in Germany have basically said, cordon sanitaire, we're not going to work with the AfD. They're far right, and increasingly that will become a harder and harder line to maintain because they are doing so well, and because so many Germans are unhappy with what the coalition is doing at the moment, and especially unhappy with the situation about migration. So it's not looking good in Germany at the moment. Seth, how about you?
We've been talking a lot about things that the Labour Party's been doing very well and is very much in control of, but something that I think has been a real Achilles heel for them has been this never-ending stream of litigation from the follow-up to the Corbyn years and various Labour factions and so forth. There has, just in the last few weeks, been a long-running case to do with an accusation that 5 Corbyn-affiliated aides had leaked a report around anti-Semitism, which turns out to have been a completely false and baseless accusation. The Labour Party spent, I think, £500,000 in legal costs on that, and they've just had to make a payout of at least £90,000 in costs, and there's more of this rumbling on with appeals. It's a really quite significant drain on resources. I mean, the legal bills alone are adding up to millions of pounds. And for a party which is trying really hard to outraise the Conservatives, who know a thing or two about raising vast sums of money, the litigation really is actually something that I think is undermining a huge amount of time and energy Labour could be spending on other things. And that's the show. Thanks to Yasmin Serhan.
Thanks for having me.
Jacob Jarvis.
Thank you.
And Seth Thevoz.
Thanks a lot.
Stay tuned for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and the traditional thank you to our army of generous supporters. You too could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how to get yours. We'll see you next time.